Hi, I'm Gregory Dell, and I'm here with attorney Cesar Gavidia, and we're going to talk about long-term disability insurance claims for ophthalmologists. And Cesar, we've represented a lot of ophthalmologists all over the country at all stages of a claim, from applying straight through extensive litigation. And so we've just about seen everything there is for ophthalmologists and every different disability insurance company. When you think about ophthalmologists, the most important thing, well, not the most important thing, but a very important thing is describing the occupational duties. Because it's not often the disability carrier is significantly challenging the medical restrictions and limitations. It's more so that we see that they're not understanding the duties of what an ophthalmologist does and they're really minimizing it. So, how do you handle that situation and how do you portray and present the occupational duties of an ophthalmologist when you're handling a claim?
Well, for me, I mean, at least in terms of the cases I've handled, one of the critical procedures and treatments that ophthalmologists often do are their surgeries. And it's absolutely critical, okay, in terms of the way that you present the practice outline and their surgical and their procedural duties outline is focusing in on all of those really critical surgical procedures and duties they perform. And the insurance company is often going to want to know, well, how much of a particular procedure are they performing or surgery they're performing? What types of surgeries are they performing? So providing as much detail and in terms of the surgeries and the volume of surgeries and the extent of these surgeries and the procedures that they perform is really, really important.
And when you're handling a claim for somebody, how does a claimant present all of that information so that the disability carrier knows what they were doing?
So, it can be presented by way of CPT codes. It's not often that you run into an ophthalmologist who doesn't have CPT codes or billing codes to be able to produce to the disability insurer. But in the rare event that that's the case, then sometimes I've had to pull calendars and schedules and different things so that we could show and prove the extent of surgery that this ophthalmologist was involved in. Okay, not just that he was doing office consults. I mean, the surgeries are the real critical procedural duties they're performing. It's really important to show the volume and the extent of surgeries that they were doing.
So, Caesar, a lot of issues we get into with ophthalmologists is this issue of total disability versus residual disability. Can you explain what that is and why we have that as a common theme that develops for ophthalmologists?
Yeah, sure. So with total disability, we're talking about basically a complete inability to be able to perform the substantial material duties of their occupation as an ophthalmologist. Okay, so basically what you're looking at there is they're removing themselves due to whatever sickness or whatever injury they have that's preventing them from performing their surgical duties, their ophthalmological procedures and duties. And they basically have a complete inability to do their profession, to perform these substantial material duties. When we're talking about partial disability, and partial and residual disability kind of are synonymous terms, and an ophthalmologist might look at their policy and it says residual disability, while they may have two or three policies. One says residual disability, one says partial disability, but they all more or less mean the same thing. And what it means is either a part-time inability to perform their substantial material duties, in other words, not able to perform them for as long a time as they used to perform them prior to disability, prior to that sickness or injury impacting their work abilities, or not being able to perform certain substantial material duties, particular types of surgeries or particular type of procedures.
I want to get a little detailed here because we've had this fact pattern often. We get an ophthalmologist who says, look, I can still do these office examinations and see the patients in the office and write the scripts and evaluate what they have going on. But I can't do the surgery. And we look at their CPT codes, and more often than not, we see that 30%, maybe 35% of the time they're in the OR, and the other 65% of the time they were in the office. And now they want to stop doing the procedures, the surgeries, and just run an office practice. But yet the disability carrier argues that they're residual, and we argue that they're total because in this scenario, more than 65-70% of their income was coming from the surgeries, and 30% was coming from the in-office procedures. Right. So how do you make the arguments about percentage of duties of what a person's doing versus the percentage of income to what they're generating, and which one rules the day in these long-term disability policies?
Well, it's a combination of both. I mean, you have, of course, the income they're generating based on the procedures they're performing is really important, because you got to kind of take basically conduct an analysis to look at what are the lucrative procedures here? What are the procedures that are really earning them their bread and butter? I mean, is it fair to look at an ophthalmologist's ability to meet with a patient, provide them a consult, and tell them they have to have surgery if they're not able to perform the surgery? What does that consultation matter if they're not able to, follow through with the surgery that they're going to perform, right? So really, that's an inconsequential or almost incidental aspect or duty of their profession, of their occupation. Okay, so it's important to look at both the income generated by particular procedures and duties, and also the procedures and duties the amount of the procedures and duties that they're performing, right? So the volume of those procedures, how much of those procedures are they showing in their CPT data, in their schedules that they're doing on a day-to-day basis, and they probably know what most of those procedures are. If they're a cataract specialist, they're probably doing 40, 50, 60% cataract surgeries, right? So that's extremely substantial.
And this scenario comes up because a lot of ophthalmologists are in a group. And what happens is they have a client base of thousands of patients, and the group says, look, we know you can't do surgery, but these 2, 3 or other doctors will cover your surgeries for you. We don't want to lose your client base of thousands of patients who are going to start looking for another group. So if you can still do some evaluations here, then, if you can continue to do valuations, we'll be okay with you doing that. But more often than not, what happens is they say, look, you were doing 50-60% of your time doing these evaluations beforehand, and now we don't see how you're saying you're totally disabled because it's 60-70% of your time. And that's when we get into that argument to say, look, you didn't go to school just to do evaluations. You went to school to do these surgeries. And you can't say the person's not totally disabled when it was only a small percentage of their income. So this is a case-by-case basis. So Cesar, we really talked about this occupational duties issues that's going to come up, but the most important thing is really proving up your medical support. And doctors are unfortunately notorious for not getting good medical treatment because they have colleagues they talk to, they are doctors, they've all gone to the general medical school, they have an idea of what's going on with them. But how important is documented medical support in order for a doctor to get approved for disability?
Well, it's absolutely critical. I mean, even just because they're a doctor themselves doesn't mean that they're immune from having the required medical support or medical foundation that they're going to need to prove their disability claim. It's the entire basis here. So even, believe it or not, I mean, it's even for a doctor, it's important for them to be under consistent care, reasonable care for the conditions that they're claiming disability from, following the advice of the treating doctors that they're seeing. It's not a problem if they know the doctor. A lot of doctors in the medical community, they'll go to somebody that they trust, that they've known for years. That's okay. That's perfectly acceptable. But it still needs to be documented. Curbside consults where, hey, I chatted with them when I saw them, when I saw them doing rounds or whatever. That's not going to necessarily cut it. You need to have it documented. It needs to be recorded in your medical records that you saw them, that you were prescribed a certain medication, that there's a prognosis, that there's a diagnosis, that there's limitations, that all the symptoms you complain of, it has to be documented, very well documented within your medical records.
Right, and the problem isn't the ophthalmologist who has an accident or some kind of injury or sudden onset of a major illness. It's the more classic chronic medical condition that's been going on for months to years. And those are the ones where you have to have a treatment history. You can't just show up at the doctor and then say, oh, I stopped doing surgeries yesterday and here I am. And people might be watching this and saying that would never happen. But
Right.
here's what does happen, Caesar, and how do you handle this? These ophthalmologists are usually underinsured, which means they don't have enough coverage to replace the income that they were making. And they don't want to stop working. And they work for months, if not years, with a documented medical condition. And we talked about these CPT reports and what they're doing. And the disability carrier is going to look at all of their procedures, all of their codes. And unfortunately, doctors are tough. They work through the condition and they get to the point where they go, I can't do it anymore. But they don't necessarily have a reduction in their CPT production and what they were doing. So what do you advise that doctor to do, and how do you overcome the argument from the insurance company to say, look, we don't doubt the diagnosis, but we don't see a reduction in duties. So why now is your ophthalmologist disabled?
Well, you've just brought up something that we see quite a bit, and this often happens when an ophthalmologist hasn't properly really prepared for submitting that disability claim. If he'd come to us, I probably wouldn't submit that disability claim yet, right? I think we would need to go through the proper analysis to say, it's not going to work here because you don't have the reduction in procedures. You don't have even really so much the loss of income here. You have some loss of income, you have a little bit of a reduction, but it's not going to be enough to meet that 20% threshold that's required. So it may require just kind of planning things a little more, okay? So if it's a matter or a question of they want to cut back so that they can, perhaps take the tension off themselves that they're having, either physically or mentally or whatever it is, so that they could step back and take a better focus on their disabling issues, focus on their treatment, maybe see if cutting back on surgeries and certain procedures and just general time in the office will help alleviate some of these symptoms because they just can't continue doing it for full time, then it may be just a matter of spacing it out, waiting, and properly preparing the disability claim to be submitted when the time is right and when there's that reduction in procedures and a reduction in income.
So for the ophthalmologist that is either savvy enough or lucky enough to be watching this video and knowing they're thinking of claiming, great. They know they're going to reach out to us or a law firm and say, help me with my claim so I don't make that mistake. But we represent a lot of doctors who didn't have that benefit, filed their claim, have the scenario they just described. And what I want these ophthalmologists to understand is that what it's going to come down to, because they will likely deny your claim in that situation, is it's going to come down to your credibility. Because basically, you're the doctor, you're the surgeon in there, in the micromillimeters that you're working in a person's eye, and you reach the point where you felt that it wasn't safe anymore. And the disability carrier doesn't have the right to say, no, get back in the OR and do that surgery on that person's eyes. It doesn't work like that. But the beauty is if you bought your policy on your own and you don't have an employer-provided policy and the disability carrier doesn't agree through an appeal process that we can do, you're going to end up in a trial, and you're going to have 6 members of the community that you never met in your life make a determination as to whether or not they truly believe that you don't feel you can perform surgery anymore as an ophthalmologist. I mean, that's the bottom line. And in terms of credibility, when we sit here and say credibility, the ophthalmologist is thinking, well, you don't know me from a hole in the wall. How does a disability carrier go about challenging the credibility of a claimant?
Yeah. So, you brought up an interesting point, right? So they may go back and they may analyze the medical records. Let's say the ophthalmologist had an MRI that was done in 2016, okay? Then they have an MRI that's done in 2018. And the disability insurer may look at that and say, these 2 MRIs, just comparatively, they don't look all that different. Okay, they doesn't look like there's been a real progression of disease here. But now he's claiming in 2020 that he's totally disabled and can't work. So that doesn't make any sense to us. So what might that disability insurer do to this ophthalmologist? Well, they're probably going to want to go out and meet with them and sit down and have an interview with them. And they may have an audio recorder set up or want to take pictures of them or something like that in an interview setting in their home. And we often recommend that they never allow the disability insurer into their home to conduct any sort of field interviews or one-on-one interviews. Or they may, do a certain amount of surveillance on them, meaning that they may stick a private investigator on them to follow them around, okay, and see what type of day-to-day activities they engage in. They may still like to, go to the golf, the driving range or something, and they have this private investigator following them to their driving range, and on their forms they're saying, well, I can't continue, performing my surgeries and continue with my duties. I'm in too much pain. I'm having too many problems, and I don't think it's safe for me to work. And they're there swinging their 9-iron away. Okay, so these are the types of things. And even though the two things are completely distinct, like you pointed out, ophthalmologists are working within micromillimeters. It's not the same as a gross motor movement with a golf club. Okay, it's comparing apples and oranges. It's not the same. So, and there may be many number of things. I mean, they'll look back at if the practice was put up for sale. Okay, they may say, okay, it's 2020. You're filing disability now, or you sold your practice a couple of months ago. But when did you put it up for sale? Oh, you put it up for sale in 2017. It's been on the market for 3 or 4 years. Well, why is that? So all of these little things that are not so much related to the medical question of your disability and your ability to, and the correlation and the ability to perform the substantial material duties of your occupation, all of a sudden become relevant to the disability insurer.
And then the other thing they love to do is hospital privileges, because all surgeons are at outpatient surgical centers or main hospitals, and they go, oh, you filed for disability on this date, but then, a month earlier or a month after you put in for privileges, and they asked if you had any medical conditions or anything, and you said no. So
right.
That's, or you reapplied for malpractice coverage.
Any piece of paper that you've completed and filled out that you've had to make medical representations on of any sort, okay, whether it's hospital privileges or reapplying for your malpractice insurance, okay, all of these types of questions are asked. What kind of medical conditions are you suffering that may impact your ability to practice or that do impact your ability to practice? Right. And you say no, nothing. But then you go to the disability insurer and tell them, well, yeah, I've had this problem for 4 or 5 years and it's gotten really bad and I'm claiming partial disability for at least the past 3 or 4 years because I've had a reduction in procedures and duties and income, and now I can't work anymore. And then they look back that 3 or 4 months ago you filled out a form saying you were perfectly fine, or at least not representing that you have these medical conditions. That's going to be a problem. That's going to be a question to your credibility.
So we touched on a handful of the issues that we've seen for ophthalmologists, but I really encourage any ophthalmologist who has a claim at any stage, whether it's applying or on claim or denial, call Caesar, call myself. We'll provide you with an immediate free consultation, which includes reviewing your policy, reviewing a denial letter if that's what's going on, answering all of your initial questions, and then letting you know immediately how we could help you. Our clients are located all over the country. We've litigated for ophthalmologists as far from Hawaii to New York to Florida and all over the Midwest. So the location is never an issue for us, and it is a convenience for you as the client as well. The other thing I always like to recommend is go through our website and look up your disability company, because we have a ton of information about your specific company, whether it's a review about your company, questions and answers, lawsuit summaries that we've written extensively, because we want you to have a flavor and an understanding as to what your disability company's like, what this industry is like, what you're up against. And the more educated you are, the better position you're going to put yourself in to get your benefits paid. And that's the ultimate goal, is to maximize the benefits under your policy and get you paid everything that you're owed. So we appreciate you taking the time to watch this video, and we'll be here should you need us in the future. Thank you.